that way. I think that's better.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. This is bright and sunny in Savannah, Georgia, and I really, thank you all for your patience. Thanks to our technology, this is incredible, right? And of course, I would like to thank, the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, people like Bijan Rani, Michael Ryder, who made it possible. We're going back and forth, making sure the technology is working fine. So here I am. Please bear with me. And, I apologize I couldn't be there, but I hope distance won't be a problem. So without further, delay, I would like to share some of my thoughts regarding the security and economic implications of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So this is a working paper right now where I have divided the paper into 3 segments. The first one is talking about the Belton Road initiatives, combining the 2 roadmaps, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. Then the second segment, which is my main focus, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, talking about Qatar, the significance of Qatar, whether the project should be reconsidered, and how the burgeoning relationship between the 2 countries is becoming a matter of concern for many others, especially India and the United States. And finally, I'll come up with some conclusions and recommendations. So the first part, the Belton Road, it's a flagship project. I'm sure since morning we have heard that many a times. It's an ambitious effort to improve regional cooperation and enhance connectivity on a transcontinental scale, right? The aim, we all know, is to connect Europe, Asia, Africa along 5 different routes. So all the initiative, it's to strengthen trade infrastructure, investment links between China and 65 other countries, which collectively account for 30% of the global GDP, 62% of the population, and 75% of known energy reserves. So, but I'm going to discuss this at length in my paper, but just to be on time, there are significant economic and policy challenges. Some of the infrastructure and policy reforms which are envisaged by the BRI are difficult to implement. There are risks starting from negative environmental implications, social implications, fiscal sustainability, etc. So I'm arguing in my paper that the countries participating in PRI projects, they need to balance these development projects with the vulnerabilities created by increased debt levels and other implications. So there are 5 main goals of the Belton Road Initiative. Again, policy coordination, connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, people-to-people bonds, which complement each other, and I'm discussing that at length in my paper, how they complement each other and how significant they are to initiate the BRI project. So basically the Belt and Road Initiative with the Silk Road Economic Belt, we see the focus on linking China to Europe through Central Asia and Russia, connecting China with the Middle East and bringing together China, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road is focusing on using Chinese coastal ports to link China with Europe and for South Pacific Ocean through the South China Sea. I had a map, I'm not sure if you are able to view the PowerPoint, but it's a fantastic Silk Road map, and courtesy goes to Council on Foreign Relations. I'm absolutely in awe. It's a beautiful map to showcase, the Silk Road Economic Belt, the Maritime Silk Road, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the 3 red dots connecting Qatar to, the Kashgar, and that is the main focus of my paper today. So, as I said, moving on to the next segment, why build the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? So, there are 6 economic corridors within the Belt and Road Initiative. The Eurasia Land Bridge, China-Mongolia, China, Central West Asia, Indochina, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, and China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And this is one of the most significant, out of this 6 other corridors, and that's again the focus of my paper. And again, I had a map which shows how the corridor, stretches from spanning across Asia, Europe, and Africa. So, as I said, the focus is on the CPEC, and I chose this because it has become a challenge these days for the Asian giants. And the CPEC, it is a very important link in China's larger Silk Road initiative because it enhances cooperation between Asia and Europe. And also, CPEC developments are a part of the Chinese agenda of the regional economic connectivity. And again, I have a map which, the French want fast track. It's about the railroads and the roads between bordering Pakistan and India and how, things are going to happen. So these plans are formalized way back, a couple of years back when they signed 51 agreements, memorandum of understanding on Chinese investments, totaling $46 billion or more in the next 10 to 15 years. So what we see right here, some of the projects, they're already underway, including highways, energy projects. Some are in the middle and some are yet to come. For example, the Gadar to Kunjurab rail link. It's included in the long-term project, which is expected to be completed if everything goes fine by 2030. So with these 4 main areas in the CPEC, which is the Gadar port, the transport, energy, industrial cooperation, these are the main focus within the CPEC corridor. And I have argued in my paper because the One Belt, One Road consists of a continental Eurasian Silk Road economic belt and a Southeast Asian maritime Silk Road. I see Pakistan has the potential to serve as a nexus for the 2 routes. It's very, very significant in this regard. So again, I had a map, the major projects of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. We see the power projects, coal, hydro, solar, wind. We also see the highway routes. And the Pakistani government, they unveiled 3 highway routes for the project, a western route through Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Then we see another central route crisscrossing the country and a northern highway route which connects Karakoram Highway via the Karakoram Highway. And this is a major symbol of China-Pakistan cooperation and only ground linkage. So it has a lot of, the geopolitical and geo-strategic significance in this regard. So now the question, why Gadar, right? So Gadar is a warm water deep sea port in Balochistan near the Strait of Hormuz, and it is at the heart of the $50 billion Chinese investment within the CPEC corridor. And as I mentioned in my paper, it's like a jewel in the crown for China in the development, which is the development of Gadar as a jewel in the crown that will give Beijing a firm and reliable access in the Indian Ocean and close to the Persian Gulf, which is, effectively making it a 2-ocean ocean power in this regard. So there are some of the things I've already mentioned, a multi-billion-dollar project about the corridor. The deal granted 40 years of operation rights. It has a lot of significance. There are challenges, there are a lot of opportunities, like, oil shipping from, Persian Gulf to the port and pumping it through the pipelines, transportation, energy, especially building pipelines to Kashgar. It's also, the routes are going to be shorter. It is going to take a 6,000 miles shorter route. It could save billions in transportation costs. It will save a lot of time. And even for Pakistan's, for Pakistan military leaders, they believe that Chinese investment, if there are a lot of investments, which is happening, of course, it can turn around nations' sagging economic fortunes, right? And it will also help them to strengthen against challengers, both foreign, like India, domestic, like anti-state insurgents. It will also generate power generation capacity, reduce unemployment, eliminate poverty, improve law and order, etc. In fact, the lion's share of the investment, around $35 billion, it's going towards energy. And if I go back to the map, a couple of slides, back, you see how coal, solar, liquefied gas, power transmission, is everything included within that lion's share. And I have mentioned in my research that if everything goes according to plan, then 21 of these projects will generate 17,000 megawatts of energy, which will literally double Pakistan's install capacity. And it will also, lessen dependence on the fewer but overwhelming, ports in the region. So that is going to be a big deal if this project is completed successfully. And of course, whether the project should be reconsidered, this is the most important part, because this is a crucial corridor, as the government has mentioned, but it is through a disputed territory between India and Pakistan. It's an illegitimate act. That's what I'm arguing in my paper, because there are severe security implications. So if you're doing a massive investment and thinking about regional connectivity, it's very important. First and foremost, you need to enhance security, correct? So security remains a major concern for CPEC. The insurgent activities in Balochistan, the Afghan Taliban, the Uyghur militants in Xinjiang province. So these are a constant threat. They're kidnapping the personnel, they're attacking the targets, they're blocking aids or materials coming into the region, etc. So what I have felt that if you really need to understand the CPEC, we need to appreciate China's security concerns, especially from those stemming from the western region of Xinjiang. So there are violent pushback for economic development. There are constant links with other terrorist organizations. The ATIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, the Uyghur militants, etc. So I believe that if China is able to tackle the threat of the jihadi organizations in neighboring Pakistan, China hopes to secure its own territory. So that's one recommendation from my side. And also, what I felt that the CPEC, it represents an international extension of China's effort to deliver security through economic development. So, of course, and if Pakistan is likewise, they're able to provide that security, if Pakistan is able to provide the infrastructure, of course, this is going to help and kind of support the project in the future. So Pakistan's relationship is a matter of concern. Yes, it is, especially as I've mentioned, for India, because it's aggravating the tension between the two countries for two reasons. One, the Gilgit-Baltistan territory, which is also claimed by India as a part of the Kashmir dispute. It's a long history. It's we don't know when we are gonna see a proper resolution, but it's there. So that is the biggest concern, along with Ghadar, because Ghadar port is perceived in India as less likely to become a vibrant economic hub than to serve as a naval base for China's expanded blue water fleet and their operations through the Indian Ocean, right? And of course, the U.S. will also have its own long-term concerns about CPEC, because it represents the leading edge of China's expanding access to likely influence within Eurasia. So I'm arguing in my paper that as Pakistan grows closer to China, there might be temptation in Washington to compete for more influence in Islamabad. Finally, with my conclusions, the CPEC is a product of the larger geopolitical trend. There are a lot of, positive implications. China will be able to save billions in time, transportation costs, shipping oil will be easy. Pakistan in general and Ghadar will serve a critical role in China's joint plans for linking China to Europe and beyond. And if this project is successfully implemented, it can serve as a model for enhancing connectivity and cooperation through similar other projects, neighboring countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, East Asia. In fact, Romania is on the way of becoming a part of the new Silk Road. So I'm working on an Erasmus grant right now, and we had a visitor coming from the University of Pennsylvania, and he did a fantastic presentation here in Georgia Southern University, the project we are working on and how Romania is developing, what are the initiatives being taken to make it a part of the Silk Road Initiative. Another observation, this project will not only pull Pakistan into the geo-strategic orbit, but it's also going to be a game and fate changer of the region. That is another observation that I'll be discussing in my paper. But there will, of course, be political backlash, because of the fear of domination by Asia's biggest economy. But in spite of, the major concern is, again, security. And I know that we all know that many are in the still planning stages. And how much of the overall initiatives will actually be implemented, time will tell. But the primary obstacle to the CPIC is security. So what we are seeing here is, like, for example, before I conclude, let me give an example. There was a proposal to kind of construct a perimeter security fence, along the entry checkpoints in Gadar. And the countries decided to do that because of the strategic significance of Gadar as a port, right? But there was backlash, because the countries felt that this scheme is going to threaten and further alienate the local communities. So the project can never succeed if the local communities don't support you, if you don't like it. So the proposal is very, very important that you take care of the security first. So what I feel, and I conclude, I believe the CPIC's viability will remain in doubt for a while. And the major reason is China's own tolerance for attack is difficult to anticipate at this point, because it's a lot of, security issues, kidnapping, things happening in that region. So, and also side by side, I believe that if Pakistan is unable to provide sufficient security, or if they fail to address the concerns of the domestic opponents, the project will fail to deliver commercial success. So in order to be successful, the CPIC would provide, if successful, the CPIC would provide important benefits to Pakistan's economy. And eventually, economic growth will lead to political stability. So right now, the question stands whether the China-Pakistan economic corridor is a road to the future. Time will tell. And also have raised a question like whether China is willing to weather more violence because the CPIC is a flagship of the Obor Initiative. So I believe with that, I think I'm on time, and at the end of my presentation, I have used some of the resources. But again, Michael, I need your help. If you can just provide the email address, to the audience, and then I will be more than happy to answer your comments. If you have any suggestions, I can communicate with you, because I will not be able to be a part of the discussion at the end. So please feel free to email me your questions, your comments, if you have any suggestions, and I'll be more than happy to, get in touch with all of you on time, I promise. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you. Michael?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Dr. Roy, and we'll definitely make sure that the audience knows how to be in touch with you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
We've discussed in our country case studies today on BRI. We've talked a lot about Pakistan and the CPEC, as we should, because, as was mentioned several times today, it's CPEC that arguably is the most, constitutes the most advanced operationalized aspect of the entire Belton Road initiative so far. But clearly when you're talking about potentially more than 60 countries, there's a lot to talk about. A lot of different country case studies you can look at. And of course, we highlighted Malaysia earlier, Sri Lanka, some of the challenges there. But for our next two presentations, we're going to hear from some areas that we have not yet discussed today. And for the one right now, we're going to be hearing from our presenter, Dr. Chun-Yi Lee, who is going to be speaking about Taiwan. She is she is Associate Professor and Director of the Taiwan Studies Program at the University of Nottingham. Please.
I would need to use the... Okay. Just minimize. It's okay? Yeah.
It's just like this.
So Michael, sorry
Yes.
to intrude. I'm going to sign off and, say thank you and have a wonderful evening, all of you. And I'll get back to work. It's sunny outside. Thank you so much, Michael. I'll wait for your communication further.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Thank
Enjoy
you,
the warm
Nadia.
weather.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Michael, for good introduction, and also thank you for the association to invite me over today to introduce you about my observation on Taiwan's new southbound policy when it's faced to China's BRI, especially in Southeast Asia countries. What I would like to present you today are my observations in the past year, 2018, when I was in Vietnam and Malaysia to conduct my fieldwork. And of course, that this is not in any attempt to compare these two schemes, but with all the different scales and investment amounts, that's not comparable. But what I would like to present is Taiwan's new southbound policy unavoidably face China's BRI, especially in Southeast Asia countries. And I would also use this observation to illustrate both China and Taiwan in the case of Southeast Asia countries when they face the societies, the difficulty. So perhaps my presentation is not entirely go into the securities concept, but I believe that the people-to-people's contact, which is the core of the BRI's end, and actually also the new southbound policy's end, is totally entangled with the securities concept. So this is what I would like to talk about. The first part would be what would be the new southbound policy. I put a quotation mark in the word of new because for Taiwan, it wasn't the first time for Taiwanese government propose a southbound policy. And in all defense that it is not to answer China's BRI. It is actually because of Taiwan's main trading partner is China. 73% of Taiwan's trade business is in relation to China. So for Taiwan, as you could imagine, it is a very severe concern of economic imbalance with China. So not in time when the current president's governance, actually way back in 1996, President Lee Teng-hui has already proposed the southbound policy. And I would tell you more about the difference between the new current southbound policy proposed by Tsai in comparison by Lee. And then I would talk a little bit about Taiwan's opportunity on the NSP, new southbound policy, And also, not only that, also the potential challenges of the new southbound policy. When we talk about the challenges, of course, this is the time for China factor kick in. So this is where I connect the BRI, Belton Road Initiative in Southeast Asia countries, in connection in the face with the Taiwan's new southbound policy. Well, at the end, I would like to do a little bit of the temporary conclusion or comparison. Well, not comparison, but just to answer how Taiwan's new southbound policy would face or encounter China's BRI in those countries. So first of all, what is the new southbound policy from Taiwan? Then the Taiwanese government has many target countries for the new southbound policy. First of all, the 10 Asean countries and the 6 states in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan, Australia, and New Zealand. Taiwanese government has great ambitions to target all these countries in the new southbound policy. So the policy is designed to form a sense of economic community and by fostering the links between Taiwan and those target countries. The community, in a sense, is through not just business investment, but more with the civil society's contact. What is the meaning of that? Taiwanese government this time, in difference between now, the Chinese government, and then this government is, Taiwanese government wants to have a more comprehensive package to be in contact with the Southeast Asia countries. So business is important, but more is to contact with the education sector, more in the sector of the civil society, if that's possible. So in a sense that Tsai Ing-wen's government, the current Taiwanese government, they wanted to have the full contact rather than just business investment. But of course, the business investment is the core to drive the rest of the civic contacts that the Chinese government is acknowledged. So in the sense of all these contacts and community sense, that is trying to establish the mechanism of the wider range of negotiation and dialogues. So in a sense, of course, Taiwanese government is not just wanting to build the contact with Southeast Asia countries. Taiwanese government also wish by doing so for those countries to understand better Taiwan could enhance Taiwan to have more international status, which is proved to be even more difficult now. The aim of the policy, of course, is to use this national will and incentives to achieve two ways exchange with the new southbound policy countries, the target countries. So pay attention on the two ways exchange. Taiwanese government wants investment to the Southeast Asia countries, or the students, Taiwanese students, go to Southeast Asia countries and also want Southeast Asia countries to invest in Taiwan, or Southeast Asia countries students come to Taiwan. So that's a bilateral exchange. Apart from that, of course, is to also encourage Taiwanese business to go to those countries to invest. As I mentioned before, 73% of Taiwanese investment is in China. It has been, in the past 3 decades, very difficult for them to change their investment destinations to Southeast Asia countries. So the new southbound policy, of course, is trying to persuade Taiwanese business to go to Southeast Asia countries. That has been failed in the previous Li Denghui's southbound policy. Then the third part is to cultivate more of the people-to-people's content, which also Taiwan wants to educate or to bring more of the human talents who knows more about Southeast Asia countries' knowledge, language, and to foster the policy, which I think is still in the process of great efforts, not quite yet there. So as a whole, that Taiwan wants to use the whole package, more comprehensive one, to create a better dialogue with those countries, and then hopefully that could increase Taiwan's international exposure, or those countries will be somehow help Taiwan to balance the China factor. The potential of opportunities of the new southbound policy from Taiwan is Taiwan has been engaged with those countries not just now. In fact, Taiwan have already started with the engagement with those Southeast Asia countries started from 1980s. For instance, Taiwan and Singapore signed the agreement between separate customs territory of not just Taiwan, but Penghu and Kinmen and Matsu of Economic Partnership, ASTEP, in November 2013. I was interviewing Taiwan's economic representative in Singapore last year in August, and he mentioned to me that this treaty has been signed in a very high standard in order to enhance the possibility of Taiwan to get into the TPP. Of course, by then, they hope that TPP would work. Well, we didn't know that TPP would result like that now, without Americans' backup. But that was in anticipation that Taiwan would be able to enter TPP, so the standard side, the regulation side at these free trade agreements, or economic partnership, because free trade agreement is another term. Economic partnership has been set up very high. And Taiwan and Vietnam also had several agreements or memorandum, basically focused on the scientific and technological cooperation, and also understanding of financial cooperation. More importantly, that is a tourist cooperation. Taiwan and Indonesia also signed the One Village, One Product and Agri-Business Cooperation Plan in 2012. Of course, the One Village, One Product idea coming from Japan, but Taiwan has easily adopted this concept and signed with Indonesia in terms of boosting Indonesia's agricultural products. Also, apart from that, along with the cooperation in agriculture, there will be more cooperation with immigration affairs, human trafficking, and smuggling prevention, along with technological cooperation. So all these treaties is just to illustrate that Taiwan has already started to work with Southeast Asia countries, for instance, Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia since early 2010, 2011. This is way before Tsai Ing-wen's government. But, of course, the challenges of the new southbound policy is the elephant in the room, China factor, the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think in connection with our morning speakers' content, I would also say that China has been more to try to present more friendly image of the Belt and Road Initiative, because at the beginning, as you all are very familiar with, it's called One Belt, One Road, or VOR. And only in 2016 changed to Belt and Road Initiative. There are two reasons for China, on my observation would be for China to do so. First of all, there's not just one belt and one road. Most of our speakers point out there are multiple belts, multiple roads. And secondly, that presents more the initiative this world is a proposal from China to the rest of the world. So China is being more polite, not to pose this idea to everybody, but in a sense, by word, it's more polite to initiate this proposal to the rest of the world. But of course, the image China present or trying to present and the image the other country received probably has a big gap. This is what I would discuss more in my later presentation. What I wanted to say is, I mentioned earlier Taiwan has engaged with Southeast Asia countries in 2010, 2012, and also in the 1990s, but actually China's engagement with Southeast Asia countries far way before Taiwan. The Greater Mekong Spatial Economic Zones and infrastructure already started in 1990s, which connect China's collaboration with Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand. China-ASEAN relationship, most of you in the audience are familiar with. I just quickly take it through that China has been the ASEAN Plus 3 since 1997, but the trust building not yet resolved into the controversial situation of the South China Sea dispute. That's been very vocal anti-China sentiment of South China Sea dispute, which I would also mention that in my case study of Vietnam, that has had a great impact of Vietnamese impression on Chinese investment. Economic cooperation-wise, it's not just Belton Road started. Actually, it is already started in 2002. ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, ASEAN-China Free Trade Area, it's completed in 2010 as being the greatest free trade area in the world, considering the population and the countries of the Southeast Asia countries. Apart from all these treaties and agreements, infrastructure and capital attraction of China, the high-speed railway, I think some of our speakers in the morning also mentioned about the high-speed railways, connection and infrastructure in Malaysia, which has been cancelled in elected President Mahathir in May. But the China's high-speed railway diplomacy has been trying to promote it by Vice President Li Keqiang for quite some time. And the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, 93 members still present, it has been a great attraction for most of the Southeast Asia countries. Why? I would say later, that image and the great capital seems not create the most expected results for China's BRI. This is from what I would present later of my case studies. Before that, I just also quickly going through the visions and actions from the government, Chinese government, issued in March 2015. That is to put into the context of China into the world economic system, which many of our morning speakers already mentioned, that China is in the map of world economy. China is in a much better connection with the global financial system, and China would to have these 5 cooperation priorities in terms of policy, facility, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bond. What I would say that this is mostly China not just China is through this Belt and Road Initiative to exert the most of the soft power of China, and in a sense that trying to connect to people. Was that successful, and what is the impact on Taiwan in those Southeast Asia countries? The case of Malaysia. Well, as I mentioned, and the morning speaker also mentioned that the changing government has a critical impact to cancel the Singapore-Malaysia high-speed railway train. However, that was a change of mind, perhaps, of Mahathir this week to say, well, the deal could be back into the table, but we don't know yet. The point I would like to say, apart from the Chinese investment has been a little bit controversial for the local recipient country, is the way of Chinese investment in those Southeast Asia countries. I use this example of Chinese investment in Jerubahu, that is forest city. It's developed by the private enterprises, but actually linked with the state, called Country Garden. That is the amount of money that would be invested is USD 58 billion, and expect to house 700,000 people. That is 20% of the entire area as of 2016 for the next 20 years. Please pay attention that these 700,000 people are all expected to migrate from China. So they do not actually much welcome the local. Well, local couldn't actually afford amount of the money that these estate would offer. So in a sense that this estate is built in the middle of nowhere of Jerubahu, the jungles before these kind of sky-high, beautiful buildings, but not connected at all to local communities. People welcome Chinese investments are local Malaysia officials. People are against Chinese investment are local Malaysia communities. So in a sense that Chinese investment from the case is not quite yet to be accepted by the local community. Also, I understand that the morning speaker, Professor Wang, mentioned that the Chinese investment is training. It needs time to train the local workers. But at the stage now, for instance, in this investment, most of the Chinese constructors are from China for this project. So to what extent, at this stage, could create a local business or local job opportunities? This is the main reason that Malaysia communities are much against of this kind of big estate investments. And also, the role of the Chinese community in Malaysia, the diaspora, Chinese diaspora in Malaysia are quite different, also quite critical in different ways. The Malaysia government has been always afraid or prevent the Malaysian Chinese to influence their own politics. The same situation in Vietnam. So I think I would suggest that the BRI's successful or not in the Southeast Asia country do need to take into the consideration of the local community and also the local country's Chinese diaspora, because that actually infects a lot of the civil society's responses to China. Those are the construction sites of the Jerubahu, very beautiful spaces, very beautiful estates, but outside is nothing. It's just a jungle. In the case of Vietnam, that is in the emphasis of people-to-people's connection. Again, that's a complicated China card. I mentioned about the 2014 Vietnam anti-Chinese riots. Many people mentioned to me that it's in the excuse of the South China Sea dispute. But in fact, most of the burning down factories of these 2014 Vietnam anti-China riots are Taiwanese factories. Why? Because, first of all, Taiwanese factories in Vietnam also didn't connect with local communities. And Taiwanese factories owners, they don't speak Vietnamese. So actually, both Taiwan and China are making similar, if I may say so, mistakes that disconnected to local community and trying and just think that whatever they invest would be accepted. And again, Taiwanese investment in Vietnam are exactly, well, very much similar to their investment in China. No value added, very polluted industries, and again, as I mentioned, that they were not connected to local community. And Taiwanese government, even though saying that the new southbound policy should encourage enterprises to go to those Southeast Asia countries, but they couldn't provide really concrete policy incentives for the business to go. So in a sense, these are the traditional Taiwanese factories style in Vietnam, and as I mentioned that there's not much of a connection of Taiwanese owners with those Vietnamese workers. And in the sense that most of the factories were burned down in 2014 around Ho Chi Minh cities are Taiwanese factories. So coming to the end, what would I think of Taiwan's new southbound policy to face China's BRI? I don't think Taiwan has any leverage in terms of security concern that American could pull out the Indo-Pacific strategy, and Japan also trying to work out more with other countries to counter China. Taiwan would never have this leverage, and Taiwan focus more of the people to people, which in my perception is not quite successful yet. The investment parts of Taiwan and China are thoroughly different though. Taiwan's investment types are mostly small and medium enterprises, as I mentioned, those factories of textiles, of toy making, And China's investment in Southeast Asia countries are state-owned enterprises for the reason that you must be familiar with, that it's most of the construction side, high-speed railway, ports, or the roads. So this is not possible. China's small and medium-sized entrepreneurs would go to Southeast Asia country. Another thing that distinguish Taiwan and China is Taiwan wish to have bilateral exchange. And for China, of course, still say that bilateral exchange is important, but at this stage, mostly it's one-way tickets from China to Southeast Asia country for the products and also for the labors. However, you could question whether Taiwan's bilateral exchange strategy could work. From what I can see, not quite yet, because Vietnam's Business Chambers representative also told me that although Taiwan would like us to invest in Taiwan, but we do not have the capacity to invest. From what I can see, perhaps that would be more of the Vietnamese or Malaysia students to come to Taiwan to study, but again, Taiwanese students, whether they are willing to go to Southeast Asia country, that is again a question mark. So investment-wise, student exchange-wise, they probably don't match that much. So the final point is the similarity is both schemes emphasize on people-to-people's dialogue and bonding. But from what I can see, that has a lot of difficulty in China's BRI, as a lot of backfire, especially local communities, whether if you wanted to say resentment or the unhappiness towards Chinese investments, and also they are not happy with the Taiwanese investment style. So to what extent the people-to-people's dialogue could actually be in the core of these two schemes, that's the question, actually a big question mark. So my observation may be a little bit more pessimistic, but this is what I can see from the ground, from the Southeast Asia country. I would like to update more when the time that I can go again this year. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for that very rich presentation. I think it's very useful to provide some context about Taiwan in this story on the Belton Road Initiative, so thank you. We're now going to move to Raffaello Pantucci, who had the shortest commute of anyone on this panel to this event today. He's Director of International Security Studies at Reseach here in London, and he's going to talk about BRI in Central Asia.
Well, thank you very much to RSA and to RSAA, to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and to King's Lau Institute for the kind invitation. I'm going to leave you Chun-Yi's contacts up there, so you have a full 20 minutes or so to write them down as slowly or as in translate them in as many languages as you want. So there's no way that they can't get back in touch with you, Chun-Yi. I do that as a favor to you specifically because I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm afraid. So you're just going to have to listen to me talking about the first strand of the BRI, China in Central Asia. So what I wanted to try to do was basically talk a little bit about China's relations with Central Asia on the basis that, from my perspective, I think that to understand what the BRI might look like going forwards, I think it's instructive to understand what's been happening in Central Asia for the past, I would argue, almost 20 years in terms of China's relations with that. Because from my perspective, I think that you get a flavor of what the kind of bigger vision of BRI is if you look at what the Chinese have been doing in Central Asia for some time up until now. So while Chun-Yi and others have pointed out that the One Belt, One Road became the Belton Road to reflect the fact that you have multiple belts and multiple roads, I would say that the first road really starts in Central Asia. And I think it's no mistake that Xi Jinping starts off his series of speeches to announce the Belton Road Initiative more broadly with the speech in Astana, Kazakhstan in September 2013. I think it's a very conscious choice for him to kind of stamp his imprint and his sort of idea on to something that had been going on for some time. Now, if we look sort of back at recent Chinese history, you'll find that there are other kind of Belt and Road type things that do actually emerge before. You can go back and look at 1999 to find the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor as a first sort of idea that was floated in the late 90s to create a sort of corridor connecting up those 4 countries. And if you go back and look at the sort of foundational documents of that particular idea, you can see again that there, a lot of the narratives they're talking about are ones that really resonate with what we see now being talked about under the broader Belton Road Initiative. But, you know, BCIM, while it was announced in 1999, it didn't really go very far. And it becomes this sort of idea that sort of bubbles up every so often, but never really matures and materializes into anything before that. Anything after that, sorry. And then even if we think back to sort of some of the more recent strands that have been captured under the Belton Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was in fact announced shortly before Xi Jinping started his series of speeches talking about the Belton Road in Astana and then Jakarta. Earlier in 2013, before he went out to Kazakhstan, Premier Li Keqiang visited Pakistan, where he signed the Memorandum of Understanding to create a China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And that sort of MOU becomes the foundational document that then later develops into CPEC more broadly. And then if you look back further at some of the speeches that were given by party leadership figures at the China-Eurasia Expo that was held in Urumqi every year since 2011, and before that was called the sort of Urumqi Trade Fair, you can see that there, the narratives that the leadership are talking about are very much about connectivity. Connectivity starting in Xinjiang and then emanating out across the sort of Eurasian landmass. So in many ways, you know, the kind of narrative of Belton Road and the narrative of the Silk Road economic belt in Central Asia comes from a pretty rich foundation. And specifically in itself, you know, was the way, you know, was the place that Xi Jinping decides to actually announce this big foreign policy idea, which I would argue has become his sort of keynote foreign policy concept idea. And there's sort of a number of things I take away from this. The first is something that has been hinted at before in some of the earlier presentations, which is that when you're thinking about the Belton Road Initiative, in many ways you're thinking about something that is a repackaging of a lot of what's happened before. So, for example, the big numbers that are talked about with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, you know, a lot of these projects were not sort of, you know, announced and started the day that Xi Jinping arrived with a big check. They had been going on for some time. You know, Zhurongji was the one who really started the conversation about turning Gwadar into this massive port for investment. This is a sort of project that had been going on for some time. And if you go back further and look at the sort of 60s, 70s, the idea to build the Karakoram Highway that would connect up China and Pakistan directly through the Kundarab Pass is something that happened really quite a long time ago. So, you know, when you're thinking about the Belton Road, you're thinking about something that has been a kind of a name, a concept that has been planted on top of things that have been going on for some time. And I think the choice of Central Asia as the one to start reflects the fact that I think in terms of the most coherent kind of narrative that you can see already existing in Chinese foreign policy that is then translated into all the many different strands of the Belton Road that we see talked about around the world, I think it's most clearly articulated in Central Asia. So I want to talk a bit about what that actually means and what this actually means for sort of China and Chinese interests in the region. I want to talk a little bit about how China's actually done this, sort of what is it that they've actually delivered when they've talked about this kind of Belt and Road strategy and how it's played out in Central Asia. And then finally, I want to pull that into the kind of bigger picture and say, well, what does this mean more generally for the rest of us to try to understand what the impact of the Belt and Road might be more broadly around the world. So first, I think it's important to understand what actually are China's interests in Central Asia. Well, I would argue that there's kind of four big parts that I would apportion to Chinese interests in Central Asia in particular. And I think the first one, which I would argue is the most crucial, is fundamentally about Xinjiang and about developing Xinjiang and stabilizing Xinjiang. I think Chun-Yi made a point in her presentation that in some ways what we're talking about with the Belt and Road is the kind of internationalization of this bigger concept from China of economic prosperity and, you know, stability ultimately generating security. You know, that kind of fundamental concept of this idea of sort of creating prosperity. You know, if everyone's rich and prosperous and has a house and a job and a wife and a child, you know, they don't want to rebel against the state. So stability will sort of be delivered. I think that sort of fundamental concept is the one that China has been trying to deploy in Xinjiang and has deployed sort of domestically for some time. I won't go on too much about Xinjiang in particular because there's a whole different sort of conversation happening at the moment in the public space about that, though I think I'd be happy to return to that if people want to. But I think the fundamental point I want here to remember is that if you're talking about Xinjiang and you're talking about delivering prosperity and development into Xinjiang, you really have to talk about developing the regions around it. because Xinjiang is really as far away from any coasts or any sort of prosperous centers as any of the Central Asian countries it's next to. You know, anyone who's been to Central Asia, you know, if you go to Uzbekistan, they will proudly tell you that they are one of 2 only double landlocked countries in the world. I'll let you figure out which the second one is, and you can come and get a prize from me later if you can figure it out. But I would argue that Xinjiang is really as landlocked as any of them. It's really far away from any seas. If you go by plane from Shanghai to Urumqi, the regional capital of Xinjiang, it's a 5-hour flight. It's another hour flight or more to get out to Kashgar. You know, you're talking about a landlocked place that's really far away from what is traditionally China's sort of bustling, you know, economic, prosperous hubs along its coasts. So if you're going to develop this region, you're going to have to develop the regions around it. And this is what I think really gives you the first sort of understanding of China's kind of key interest in Central Asia. It is that if we can make this region around it prosperous and stable, that will have a sort of reflected effect onto Xinjiang and ultimately help stabilize Xinjiang and therefore help stabilize the country and therefore help strengthen the Communist Party's rule over the entire country. So I think that's a key point to remember. And it's a key one that I'll come back to in some of my conclusions because I think it helps explain why it really is so important for China, for what's going on in Central Asia to work. I think the second point, and this is sort of repeatedly articulated in speeches that you'll see leaderships give in Xinjiang or about the region, it's about opening up routes to Europe and opening up sort of Eurasia. You know, quite clearly someone in Zhongnanhai has read their Mackinder and remembered that, you know, if you control this core part of Eurasian heartland, then you help control the entire Eurasian continent. And so opening that up and creating a sort of corridors of prosperity across the region to ultimately connect up Xinjiang to the richer markets either in Russia or further afield to Europe will ultimately help the region, but will also help sort of open up this entire space. I think it's also important to gain access to Central Asian resources. Central Asia is a very, loosely, sparsely populated area. I mean, some parts of it are very crowded. If you go to sort of the Fergana Valley, you're talking about a fairly, not very dense, but you're talking about an area where there is some populations. But if you look at a country like Kazakhstan, which is the size of Western Europe and has a population of roughly 17 million, you're talking about a very big empty space. That has within it, however, huge energy resources. If you go to Turkmenistan, this is a country that has, I think, the world's second largest gas reserves onshore. If you look at some of Kazakhstan's fields, you're talking about some of the biggest natural energy fields around the world. And it's not only about hydrocarbons and energy and gas. It's also about copper. It's also about gold. It's also about lots of other sort of natural resources that you can find in the region. So getting these to ultimately help feed the sort of Chinese economic machine as it continues to grow is also very important. And I think the final point to remember about what is China's interest in Central Asia is, I think, to some degree, it's a way for China to start to map out what China's bigger role for itself on the world stage looks like. I often think that if you think about Central Asia and you think about Chinese foreign policy in the region, you've got something that I would argue they use as a kind of testing ground for different methods. So the first international security organization, multilateral one, that China sort of helped create on the planet is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an institution that is very Central Asian focused. And you can find this in lots of other ways, that China kind of tests out some of its early ideas of foreign policy or security policy in the Central Asian context, and then ultimately tries to deliver them elsewhere. And one could even say that the Belton Road, in some ways, was first tested out in Central Asia and then translated into all these other contexts around the world. So those are the sort of 4 reasons I would give for why China has an interest in Central Asia. And the other point I'd make is that this has been going on for some time. The narratives I've spoken about, all of these points I've made are ones that don't just start in 2013 when Xi Jinping gives a big speech in Astana, but go back to the end of the Cold War and even before that. China has been trying to create sort of some stability and border delineation with the Central Asian states since the creation of the Shanghai Five in the 1990s, which is a sort of border demarcation organization to help define what its borders were with what was before the Soviet Union and then became Russia and 3 of the Central Asian countries. And that ultimately turned into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The concern around Xinjiang is something that goes back a very long way, but really sharpened, I would argue, in 2009, when you had rioting in the region, which led to such turmoil that the then leader Hu Jintao had to leave a G8 summit in L'Aquila, Italy, to come back and help manage the situation. That led to a sort of renewed push to try to stabilize and economically develop the region that led to a sort of spill-on and knock-on effect into Central Asia. And then finally, I think in 2012, when you saw Wang Jisoo articulate the idea of a march westward, and this idea of China needing to stop focusing so much on its relations to the seas, but instead to look across the land, to look across that borders that it had to its west, to try to refocus its sort of attention and try to not become so obsessed with this relationship with Washington. So all of these are things that predate the Belton Road, and sort of give you a flavor of something that's been going on really for some time, but ultimately is fundamentally about helping develop and stabilize China in particular. So how have they actually done this? And what is actually China's sort of approach to Central Asia at the moment? Well, this is something I can bang on about for a very long time, but I'll try to narrow it down to basically three broad areas of focus. First is economic, second is political, and third is security. A very traditional structure, as any of you who work in international relations will find. So I think first on the economic side, as I said before, it's about natural resource extraction and development of these resources. And you'll find Chinese companies getting into natural resource extraction across the entire region. I think we have a habit of just focusing on hydrocarbons, but if you look, for example, at copper, or you look, for example, at some of the other raw materials that exist in the region, you'll see that China has really started to invest quite heavily across the board. And furthermore, another important sort of natural resource that you find China investing in heavily is agriculture. You can see Chinese agri-businesses are doing massive deals, growing volume of deals in Kazakhstan in particular, or actually more recently, if you look at Uzbekistan, where since the passing of President Islam Karimov, the country has definitely shifted into a more sort of open space, and this has resulted in a flurry of Chinese activity, including really substantial agriculture deals happening. So opening, in many ways, Uzbekistan to the opportunities of China, but also China to the opportunities of Uzbekistan. It's about infrastructure construction. I'm not going to repeat this here, but it's really about building roads and rail links and pipelines and power lines across the entire region. But I think, again, there, it's important to focus not just on the infrastructure that we all immediately think about, which is road and rail. It's power stations. It's gas remetering. It's infrastructure really at every kind of level. If you go to sort of lots of these Central Asian cities, you'll find that increasing numbers of their infrastructure projects across the board are being delivered by Chinese companies, are being delivered often with loans from Chinese companies, and this is, again, something that's been happening for some time. It's about opening up these markets, and you can see this again if you go to any of these markets and find them full of Chinese traders and Chinese goods, who are ultimately, coming there using the roads that the Chinese companies have built before them to ultimately help get in there. And you can see China is trying to open up these markets further through various trade agreements and other bilateral discussions that they've tried to establish to try to make them more open to Chinese products. China, we all think of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a fundamentally security organization. But, I've been through a number of presentations in China where I've heard Chinese presenters tell me how the SCO, their big idea of it, was to actually create a kind of economic space, to create a free trade area under the SCO. To bring together those countries together and ultimately to let China have easier access to their economic spaces. And then on the economic side, it's about prestige projects. You'll find Ministry of Foreign Affairs, presidential palaces, large roads connecting up the president's hometown to the capital city are often delivered by Chinese companies, often as a gift, to help sort of win favor with the local leaders to ultimately help them get greater economic access and security access within that country. On the political side, it's a whole range of different activities, from scholarships and offerings of education to various young people in these countries to go and study in China, to sponsoring local researchers. I think one of the most interesting phenomena you can find increasingly in Central Asia is you'll find that if you talk to sort of a lot of the middle classes, they would love to send their kids to universities here in London or in the United States, but it's really quite expensive, it's really quite far away. And yet China offers universities that are increasingly moving up the sort of international rankings and are quite close by. These parents can also see that the economic geography in their region is shifting towards China. And so having a son or a daughter who can speak Mandarin, who's got links to that country, is definitely something that they favor. One of my funnier encounters in Central Asia was going to the Confucius Institute down in Osh in Kyrgyzstan and asking a classroom full of students, so why are you all learning Chinese? Very few of them said they'd done it because they had great love for, Confucius or some, something like that, or Jackie Chan movies or anything. But the amount of them who said to me, well, my dad wants me to learn it because he wants me to be able to go trade in Guangzhou was fairly high. So there's a sort of practical element to this, as well as, you do find the odd one who really has a sort of passion for the language and the country, but, there is a very pragmatic element to it. But there is a consequence to that, which I'll come to a little bit later. And you can see China, if you look at where Xi Jinping or where the leadership are often going and people they're meeting with, they really meet with their Central Asian counterparts a lot. You'll find that the meetings that happen either under the SCO auspices or under other auspices with Central Asian leaders is really quite substantial. And there's a political dimension to that in terms of building closer and closer links. And then the final sort of political element to highlight is the size, frankly, the physical size of some of the Chinese embassies that you find in Central Asia, where they're these sort of giant buildings that are going up, often that are not very full of people. If you ask the Chinese, why is it so large, they'll say, well, we're planning for the future. But, I often think there's also something to be said about the fact that it's bigger than the American one, which often tends to be in the same sort of area, and that in itself sending a very strong political message to the region. And then the final element I'll talk about within this sort of stuff of what China's actually doing is on the security side. And this is one that I think is often overlooked in a very simplistic narrative that we take with Central Asia, where we say that the Chinese do the economics while the Russians do the security. Well, I don't think this is very true, and I went to a very fascinating conference hosted by Nadege last year, where we talked a little bit about China's increasing sort of security footprint around the world. And I think within Central Asia, you can see a growing number of trainings happening where Central Asian security forces, for the most part interior or border guard forces, are being brought to China to learn Mandarin in some cases, to receive sort of training, to have sort of experiences, and to build connections to ultimately help increase Chinese influence and connectivity with those particular units. They're giving them equipment. If you look along Tajikistan's border with Afghanistan, you can see that China is building and gifting a number of bases, border posts for the Tajik armed forces to have to help defend themselves from Afghanistan, from problems that might come from there. You can see the same in Kyrgyzstan, where they are increasingly giving equipment and basing to the local security forces. And then in military sales. This is a region that traditionally has relied on Russia for most of its sort of military hardware. Well, interestingly now, you can see that there's a growing number of purchasing happening from China. If you look at where the Uzbeks, the Turkmen, and the Kazakhs have all purchased their new drone UAV platforms from, they bought Chinese ones. And in the Uzbek case, they're even trying to build a base in Uzbekistan where they will actually be able to construct some of these things together, which is exactly what the Uzbeks want, who want to be able to try to ultimately help develop this capacity themselves. And so this is the first step on maybe getting some Uzbeks trained up to start doing that. And then finally, within the context of the SCO, China's not only helped sort of continue to let this organization flourish, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but it's even gone further and started to create other minilateral regional security organizations to focus on its particular security concerns there. And I'm thinking in particular of a small multilateral that was started back in 2016 of the Quadrilateral Coordination and Cooperation Mechanism between China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, which is ultimately about securing China's border land with Afghanistan, but help bring together the chiefs of army staff of those four countries in a regular format to ultimately help deliver security in the region. So these are the kind of mechanisms that China is using. What is the result of all of this? And I offer 7 bigger points, or 7 points that I pull out from this, which I think might be useful to think about within the sort of more global context of understanding BRI's impact globally. I think the first one is the growing number of Chinese nationals that you're finding in these places. So within Central Asia, you've seen a growing number of Chinese working in these countries, a growing number of sort of families establishing themselves there, a businessman going there and staying for sort of growing periods of time. But this has a corollary effect. This means there is now a Chinese population in Central Asia or in other BRI countries that Beijing needs to worry about. And we've seen in a lot of these countries, you're talking about fragile states that are prone to internal conflict, that are prone to terrorist groups, and ultimately they will potentially look to the Chinese authorities to ultimately help protect them. And that presents a bigger kind of problem for China when they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do and how do we manage these problems in the longer term? I think we have to question the long-term influence implications. If we look at Central Asia, an interesting anecdote I heard recently from a friend who visited the Ministry of Defense in Bishkek was they were surprised, and this is Kyrgyz, they were surprised by the volume of officials they found who could speak pretty workable Mandarin. Now, that's one ministry in one country. If you go around all the other countries, you'll find this is increasingly true. Now, that has a longer-term influence effect. what if you're talking to these ministries, you're talking to the middle classes and their children in these countries, and their increasingly international experience is one that's founded in China. That does have a sort of soft power effect as we track forwards. The next generation is increasingly being brought up with China in mind as the great power. One of the big complaints you'll find in Central Asian countries is if you get outside the capitals and you don't speak either the local language, you can struggle sometimes increasingly to get by. It used to be you could rely on Russian. Well, that's not always the case anymore. So the Russian sort of influence is losing a little bit of traction there. I don't want to overstate this. Russia is still a very important language and a very important power in the region. But, track forwards 20 years, when you've got a growing number of younger people and children who speak Mandarin, who've got an experience of going to university there, and how will that sort of change the dynamics? Translate that globally, and you'll see you'll raise some interesting questions elsewhere as well. There's a question about how much you've got China displacing the traditional kind of power in the region, and what are the kind of consequences of that? Within Central Asia, we're talking about Russia, but if we look at parts of Africa where BRI touches, or parts of the Middle East, or parts of Southeast Asia, who is the sort of traditional influencer there, and how does the dynamic change with China becoming the more dominant kind of relationship? And often this is founded very heavily on economic links, which is, displacing potentially other countries' companies or other countries' economic influences and economic interests in these places. But there is an influence impact that plays out there. When we think about the cyber domain, and we think about the growing numbers of countries that are taking Huawei infrastructure, taking ZTE infrastructure, or even if you look at a country like India, where companies like Xiaomi or Huawei are basically depending their sort of future economic growth on selling their handphones in these particular countries. There is a question about what the kind of longer-term influence and impact of that is. And there's an interesting question for China about if you become the kind of dominant economic player and you become the dominant sort of figure building and helping these countries develop, then you also to some degree become responsible or find that they will turn to you when they have problems. And what does that mean? Does China have to become an arbiter in some quite difficult and thorny complex conflicts around the world? On the other side of that, China becomes a focus of external anger. So an interesting dimension in Central Asia is you'll find a growing number of protests that you see against China. At the moment, we can see in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, there's a lot of anger being articulated towards China because of some of the Kyrgyz and Kazakh nationals that are getting caught up in what is happening in Xinjiang. But previously, we've seen that, the region has complained a lot about China, and they complain a lot at Chinese companies. And often, they're not so much complaining about the Chinese companies, they're often really complaining about the local government. But they can't complain about the local government because the local government is very sensitive to these questions, but they can complain about the Chinese. And so you have China becoming the focus of anger internally. And then finally, the point I make around this would be a question that was raised before in Chun-Yi's point, which is when you're looking at a lot of the sort of BRI investments that happen at the sort of government-to-government level, these are big projects, state-driven, state-owned enterprises engaging with their sort of counterparts in these countries. These are very state-driven projects. They don't necessarily bear in mind some of the local complaints and local issues. And in some contexts, this can exacerbate local problems. So if the problem is that the people are not very happy with the state and the way it's been treating them, if a country like China comes in and invests very heavily at this kind of state-driven level, well, you're potentially exacerbating that very problem that we're seeing that was already sort of existing in the country. So, those are the kind of 7 strategic points I would add that we could draw from the lessons in Central Asia that are applicable more broadly. I'll add 3 very brief points because I think I'm coming towards the end of my time, and Michael is being very polite and not throwing things at me. The first is I think we do have to add a caveat here about Central Asia, which goes back to the point I started with, which is talking about Xinjiang. And this is why I think the comparisons with Central Asia and the rest of the world in terms of trying to understand go to a certain point, but we have to be careful not to take them too much further. Ultimately, Central Asia has to work from a Chinese perspective because it's about domestic stability and domestic security. So, if a BRI project in Africa goes horribly wrong, yes, it can be politically embarrassing and a bit awkward, but ultimately, it's all the way over there. This is happening on your border. This is something that you can't let go into that same direction. I think the debt question, which comes up an awful lot in the discussions around BRI, I think it's not totally always relevant within a Central Asian context, because partially 3 of the countries actually do have some money, though one can question some of the accounting in some of them, but also because the volumes of money we're talking about are relatively smaller. And while they're very important for these countries, we've seen tradition that China has been willing to kind of roll over debts and happy to sort of manage them in a way that the country doesn't have, some of the sort of debt concerns that we see in other countries don't necessarily play out. And then final, I think, the key, in some ways, is to think about why, if I go back to the beginning, and I was saying that, from China's perspective, Central Asia matters because it's ultimately about developing China. And this idea of creating connectivity and helping China develop and helping sort of increase prosperity. This language and this framing of connectivity and prosperity is quite a positive contrast to some of the narratives we see at the moment in the sort of public discourse around the world. And so in some ways, this is something that China is able to paint a relatively positive vision for. And I think this positive image is something we sometimes forget, sat here in London or sat in other Western capitals, where you look at these and you look at them from an external perspective, you say, well, clearly you've got an actor here who's taking advantage of these poorer countries and getting them into these very difficult situations. Now, this may be true, and there are some issues there that need to be worked with, but seen on the ground, there is a sense that you've got a power here that is investing in these countries, that is bringing connectivity, is opening our markets, is giving us opportunities. And that is a positive vision that I think resonates in some parts of the world. They do see lots of problems, and they do see a certain amount of pushback, but ultimately you do see an interest in saying that, yes, there is an economic geography here that is important to us and is important to our futures. And that, I think, messaging is something that does play out, and you've seen it play out repeatedly in Central Asia. I go to Central Asia and I talk to people on the ground, and people endlessly say, oh, there's problems with this, and the Chinese company treats us badly with that, and they all have stories of pollution and other problems that play out. But they don't fundamentally disagree with the underlying logic that China is an important economic partner for them. And I think that element is something that you definitely see playing out in Central Asia, and is an important element to think about more broadly with the BRI and the narratives that we see with it globally. And with that, I will leave it, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Raffaello for that very important reminder of the centrality that Central Asia plays in the BRI story. Incidentally, a number of years ago, the U.S. government came out with this initiative called the New Silk Road Initiative, which was meant to respond to what China was doing, and Central Asia was the main component of that initiative, which incidentally didn't really get anywhere. So with that, we're going to go to our 4th speaker for this panel, and I think it's the perfect coda to our series of presentations today. We're going to be hearing from Nadege Rolland. She is a fellow, a senior fellow for political and security affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Very well-regarded independent think tank based in Seattle, but also in Washington. The Wilson Center is fortunate to have partnered with NBR on several occasions. Nadege will essentially be picking up on the issue of what's next, essentially, among other things. So, Nadege.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also to the Royal Society for Foreign Affairs and the Wilson Center and King's College for putting together this remarkable event today. I have the privilege of being the last speaker. That's very difficult following Raf, because he's a very great speaker, which I'm not, so apologies in advance. But that also means that by now, after you have been listening to my distinguished colleagues all day long, you have a better grasp of what the Chinese leadership wants to achieve, what's the scope and scale of its ambitions, and also of the challenges that are starting to emerge, not just for China itself, but for the recipient countries and for the world in general. Belton Road is basically China's endeavor to pull the rest of the world closer to its economic and political center of gravity in a manner that serves its interests and reflects the Chinese Communist Party's worldview. It's giving us a taste of how China, as a risen power, wants to assert its global influence, and many countries do not seem to like the BRI's aftertaste. The one that comes after grand promises of prosperity and connectivity and shared future for whole humanity. it leaves you with a long list of new economic and security challenges. And in many ways, 2018 was the year of the pushback against Belton Road. I'm going to describe that in a little while. Many commentators have rapidly come to the conclusion that this is the end of the road for BRI. But not Xi Jinping, who in his end-of-the-year speech gave an upbeat picture of China's achievements and said that it will continue to push ahead with the construction of the Belton Road. But this doesn't mean that the Chinese leadership is so obdurate that he will lead BRI into the wall, and I will argue actually that it's the opposite. There is a beginning of a course correction that we can observe, and I will describe it in my presentation. So first, what is happening? We've been witnessing a wave of both internal and external resistance against Belton Road. First internally, last July, there's been several Chinese university professors who publicly criticized the level of Chinese foreign spending to countries in Africa and elsewhere, basically blaming their government for throwing money around. Before this latest outburst, other academics had expressed their concern that China should keep with its long-standing low profile in in foreign affairs, instead of taking the lead and risking an overstretch. Internationally, the first signs of resistance against Belton Road came in 2015 with Indonesia and Thailand, who shelved high-speed railway projects due to issues with China over funding and land acquisition. For the same reasons, Bangladesh turned to Japan instead of China in 2017 to build its first deep-water port. Nepal canceled a hydropower Chinese-led project. And of course, now you're all very familiar with the decision by the Sri Lankan government in December 2017 to hand over the management of the Hambantota port for 99 years, which sparked a worldwide alarm about China's strategic intentions and also allegations about debt trap diplomacy. In May 2018, the newly elected Malaysia president announced his intention to renegotiate the terms of several contracts with China, as we've seen this morning, rejecting them as equivalents to unequal treaties and a new vision of colonialism. And in the following month, Pakistan, the Maldives, Sierra Leone, Myanmar also began to reconsider the scope of the cooperation with Beijing. So in all, there's a mounting concern over deals that are perceived as unfair or corrupt, and this has prompted a closer examination and even a suspension of projects that used to be taken for granted. In addition to some recipient countries having second thoughts, there's also an increasing effort from countries in Europe, in the Asia, Indo-Pacific region, in the US, to come up with some alternatives, some alternative infrastructure investment schemes in order to compete with what Belton Road has to offer. So Professor Yi talked to us about the New Southbound Initiative, but there's also, the Indian and Japanese cooperating with the Americans to fund some new infrastructure in the Indo-Asian Pacific region. There's also Japan partnering with Australia and with the US. There's the announcement by the Secretary of State Pompeo last July that the US will invest $113 million, which is not that much, but it's a start, in technology, energy infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region as well. And finally, the EU Commission that unveiled plans to improve the transportation, energy, and digital infrastructure between Europe and Asia. But despite those recent setbacks, I think that the Chinese leaders appear undaunted. This is due in part to the fact that the change in international perceptions did not come as a surprise for Beijing. All the potential difficulties that BRI would have to face were carefully dissected by Chinese experts and advisors to the central government in the early stages of BRI's launch. They had foreseen a long list of hurdles, including China's own lack of familiarity with the local conditions of the social, political complex countries, the possibility of heightened economic and security risks like terrorist attacks or local sabotage by insurgent groups, and the criticism both from great powers and recipient countries. And this is not to say that the Chinese leadership is dismissive of the headwinds that BRI now faces, but I think that their assessment of the current situation is likely more measured than what we can read in much of the Western commentary. Not only Beijing is mentally prepared to the possibility of hurdles on the way, but also I think that their current assessment is rather positive. Official sources in China have established that over the past 5 years, over 3,000 projects have been undertaken under the Belton Road umbrella. And even if those figures have been inflated to please the central government, the number of failures that have come to public attention to date is still quite small in comparison. Some of the countries that had put projects on hold have already come back to the negotiating table, as was underlined this morning. Nepal, Myanmar, and even Malaysia still wants to be within the Belton Road initiative. The heightened wariness about debt trap diplomacy may mean that the Hambantota story might not be replicated elsewhere. But even if it's not, however, China has in effect gained control over one of the Indian Ocean's key strategic positions for the next century to come. So all in all, I think the potential long-term gains seem to be more important to Beijing than the present-day alarm. Even so, the Chinese leadership is not tone-deaf, au contraire. It's very attuned to the wave of discontent, and there is evidence that it has already recently decided to undertake what amounts to a slight course correction. BRI's strategic objectives remain essentially unchanged, but there are some tactical changes on the way. At the end of last August, Xi Jinping chaired a high-level symposium dedicated to the Belton Road to celebrate its 5th anniversary. He didn't dwell too much on the past, although his assessment was quite generally positive, but he mostly set the direction for the next phase. So he said that China needs to pay attention to the needs and sensitivities of the local governments and population, and these should be better taken into account. The big government-to-government projects were a great kickstart for Belton Road, but now is also the time to work on small-scale projects that were meant to respond to the immediate needs of the local population. To enhance the perception that BRI will bring real gain for the masses instead of only the elites, Xi encouraged the promotion of people-to-people exchanges. So going back to what has been said earlier, more education programs, more tourism, and cooperation in other sectors, such as the science and technology, etc. And while doing that, also, he asked for the propaganda apparatus to optimize the accompanying propaganda campaign to focus more on the positive impact that BRI will have on the people's daily lives. Xi also instructed the party to strengthen its oversight and, in particular, to pay attention for risk assessment and mitigation. And finally, he admonished the businesses and the SOEs, the state-owned enterprise that are operating overseas, to act as BRI ambassadors, making sure that their behavior and their practices reflect well on projects that will be worthy of praise. He also asked Chinese provincial governments to ensure that the projects connect back to them and feeds their own economic development. In advancing BRI, Xi Jinping insisted there are no bystanders. So it's really a collective effort. So as a conclusion, BRI, as you may know by now, is not just about infrastructure building, and it's not even just about economic cooperation. Rather, as Xi Jinping himself made clear during the August symposium, it's nothing less than a means to improve the global governance system and to bring forth a community of common destiny. This is a term that we have heard many times today. In other words, BRI reflects China's vision for its own global role as a great normative power and its ambitions for a Sino-centric regional order. BRI is at the core of the CCP's strategy to achieve the China dream of the great rejuvenation of the nation. It's both too important to fail and too important to be abandoned. But BRI is also a laboratory, or as Professor Wang said this morning, it's still a baby. So it's the first time for Beijing that has launched an initiative of such broad scope and scale. And the CCP leadership believes that it will take time and effort for both the outside world and the party itself to adjust to this new reality. And adjusting is exactly what the CCP is doing. As the Western countries begin to step into the BRI game, the Chinese leadership has already begun to make the next move. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nadege, for those very helpful closing remarks and for the brevity of your closing remarks. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I think we're keyed up for a great discussion. I'd like to invite Dr. Shirley Yu to come back. Dr. Yu, for those of you who were here in the morning, she presented in the morning but had to leave and was not able to be here for the Q&A for the first round, so we thought we'd invite her to join it for the second round. I'm just going to put two questions on the table for our panel before I open it up. The first question, this morning, Carrie Brown put a wonderful question to the table. It was such a good question that I'd like to put it. I'd like to put the same question to this group because it's a new group of speakers, and that is on this question of sustainability, BRI and sustainability. Can it succeed? What would it take to succeed? What might be some of the trigger points or shocks that may maximize the possibility of it succeeding or failing? So that's sort of one broad question that I would put to the group. And the second question is a bit more specific. We've talked about a lot of regions, we've talked about a lot of case studies, a lot of countries today. One country that we really haven't hit on in terms of how it fits into this BRI story is the question of India. I think we did hear a bit on the India issue from Dr. Roy earlier, but India, of course, is a top strategic rival of China. India's position toward BRI, like that of the United States, has not been particularly explicit or clear. I would argue it's a pretty complex position. India and China clearly have a very complicated relationship, but one that does work on many levels, particularly on the economic side. And during a recent summit with Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, there was a conclusion that the two countries wanted to figure out ways to cooperate on connectivity projects in Afghanistan. So that's very interesting. So I would just put that question. I know that several of you, I think Raffaello, you may have written something on the India question very recently. I imagine others may want to weigh in on it as well. So leave it with that. So the first question, a very broad question on, is BRI sustainable? What should we be looking for down the road in terms of what might maximize the chances of it being sustainable? And then secondly, this consideration about India. So would anyone like to start? Please.
Okay, about the sustainability and will it succeed? I think someone this morning started to answer that question about the fact that there's so many layers to Belton Road that it depends on what component of it you're looking at. So For sure, it's easier to quantify the number of investment that China is doing abroad than it is to quantify in terms of actual political influence that it gets in the end. And it's easier to maybe start to trace the number of people-to-people exchanges, the number of tourists, or the number of scholarships that emanate from China to those countries, rather than tracing the exact impact that Raffaello alluded to earlier. 20 years from now, how are these elites going to be trained and in China and completely fluent in Mandarin? How are they going to influence their own government's policies? That's a question for the future. So it is a long-term effort too. We need to remind ourselves that's five years. It's very early. So we need to also keep this in mind. I think the sustainability more generally is going to be, it's not because China wants things that things are necessarily going to happen. That's, all the countries have agency. They have their own choices to make their own options. And the more options are offered to them, the less we're going to see them caught in the middle and say, well, there's nothing else we can do. We have to go back to Beijing because of geographic proximity, because of our ties, or our economic ties, or our political ties with Beijing. And so that's why I think it's important to keep the options open and not just have one voice. So hard to answer that question of sustainability, but as I hope I hinted at today, the Chinese leadership is extremely perceptive of the obstacles ahead as well, and so is trying to adapt to respond to those challenges as well. So there's a chance that we are going to run behind a little bit if we don't pay attention.
Thank you. Go ahead, and then Raffaello.
So I mentioned about the multi-layered grand strategy for China's BRI initiative in the morning, so I'd like to just continue that conversation. So I think the sustainability would depend on what I can think of, five elements. The first one is really China's sustainability of the Chinese economy. And so we talked about China having this unique China development model. And so if the Chinese economy were to incur at some point down the road a hard landing, then it's going to be fairly difficult for China to sustain both the domestic economy and all these very complex international development strategies at the same time. So the first element to the sustainability of the international perspective of the BRI strategy is essentially to maintain a healthy speed of the growth of the Chinese economy. The second element is there should be no major shock in the world's security framework. And so currently, as we have heard from our panel this afternoon, that the US has perceived China as a potential strategic rivalry. And so as long as it's okay to be in a competitive position, even in a position that's seen as a strategic rivalries, but there should be no major shock to the security framework, meaning outright wars or maybe change of positions within the continental Eurasia region or in maritime Asia Pacific. And so the third element will be contingent upon China's ability to continue to invest. And there has been a lot of speculations, which we didn't very much cover today, is the aggregate size of the entire investment within the Belton Road initiative. And there has been really no clear articulation from Beijing's official perspective. There's a lot of speculations, and I believe from The Economist, a recent estimate says that it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of $1 trillion in size. And if we were to look at it, AIIB was initially funded with $10 billion US. And the Silk Road Fund funded with $4 billion. The New Development Bank, which was formerly the BRICS Bank, that's composed of the 5 BRICS countries. It's in aggregate of $10 billion in size, but really the majority of the investment is going to come from China Development Bank, which is the state policy bank. And so the first batch, I believe, was somewhere around $20 billion, close to that size. But those are the official records that we could retrieve. On top of that, all the SOE investments and SOE indirectly lending from the state institutions and so forth, all pumping into the Belton Road Initiative. And if, according to The Economist, if the aggregate size is about $1 trillion, and I believe this morning we just announced, or China just announced, the official foreign currency reserve is roughly about $3 trillion US dollars in size. And so if we look at the perspective, it's quite a large financial commitment, even for a size of economy like China's. And so China's ability to continue to invest is going to determine the success of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so that's number 3. Number 4 is going to be China's ability to protect these massive investment projects overseas. And that was mentioned earlier in the morning, because of a lot of these countries in Central Asia, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, you're talking about frequent change of regimes, maybe military coups, maybe, highly unpredictable political architectures in there. And so any change of the political environment in these recipient countries can directly cause the China projects to be forsaken, or to be aborted. And so how would China control the political risks, not only within its own territory, but along this whole huge complex region? I think that's going to be a very high risk on the horizon in order for China to balance between the investment initiatives and the security protection of these assets. And number 5, we talked about pragmatic solutions to many of the relationships bilaterally or multilaterally within the Belt and Road region. Being pragmatic, it's always good, and we understand really how utilitarianism works in the UK. But in addition to all the hard power deployments by China across this region of 60 plus countries, really, essentially, what's going to determine its future is going to be the soft power elements. And Stephen Halper, a professor from Cambridge over here, said, China's greatest fear is American ideas. And I think if we were to reverse it, America's greatest fear could be China's ideas, that is the soft power elements, because countries are like humans. Countries don't really want to say that I live or die for money. They want to live or die or follow someone or progress for something grander. And so that is the soft power element, and I think China needs to continue to foster and to work on.
Thank you. Raffaello?
Thank you. No, 2 really interesting questions. I mean, I think on the first one, I think on the sustainability point, I'd build on what Shirley was just saying and say, people want a kind of vision to follow. And I think that's the key point about BRI, is that it is more a concept and a vision than a specific project. And I think if that's the parameters you're operating under, then the goalposts of what success looks like in that are pretty mobile. So I think this is the key point about it. I think the question of can BRI be sustained, can it survive, I think these are sort of, in some ways, the wrong question to ask, because there you're asking a question really about a specific project, right? So I do an investment of 1 billion country X, is that going to succeed or fail? That's a question you can answer. It either has worked or it hasn't worked, right? If you're talking about a foreign policy vision, which is fundamentally about increasing connectivity and making prosperity and all these wonderful things, then your goalposts are very, very mobile. So really, what failure is going to look like within that context? Well, you don't necessarily ever need to encounter it. Because all you can do is redefine what it was it meant in that particular context, and therefore move happily forwards, and then life will go on, and we'll all continue to seek prosperity and so on. So I think that in some ways that's the question around sustainability from that perspective I struggle with, because I think it's really more of a message than a specific project. I also think this question about, I agree, if the Chinese economy comes grinding to a halt, yeah, we'll see a lot less BRI investment going out. I'm sure they will redecorate that change in context in some sort of very nice and positive way, and it'll be articulated very clearly in repeated speeches around the world. But I think the other point I'd make is actually from an economic perspective, if you look at the Chinese companies, for example, that are doing projects, or the banks and the loans that they're taking outside, the debt burden they're carrying within China is so much more than the debt burden they're carrying outside China. And so for these companies, that's their bigger concern. The bigger concern is not that my project in Tajikistan goes wrong, it's that my project in Shandong goes wrong, because that has massive repercussions to the country, to the company, and that is a huge sort of problem. In some ways, the 100 million that they parked in Tajikistan, yeah, if that goes wrong, well, let's not do that again and move on with our lives, but it's not the kind of game changer that the sort of state failure at home is going to happen. So in some ways, I think that, you articulate very clearly in some ways the numbers you pointed out with the AIIB and the Silk Road Fund. I mean, the numbers that those institutions that we all talk a lot about, these are rounding errors, for China Exim Bank or China Development Bank or ICBC's domestic lending. These are just irrelevant numbers in their bigger picture. So I think that's an important element to remember when we think about the impact of a sort of sudden slowdown in China on some of these BRI investments. And the one caveat I would add to this, however, is if we think about some individual countries. So if you look at some individual BRI countries, and the two I like to focus on is Czech Republic and Georgia, where actually, if you look at the investment that's happening under the BRI umbrella, it's really a story of one company. And so in Georgia, it's Xinjiang Hualing, and in the Czech Republic, it was CEFC. And there you've got one single company that is essentially controlling, manipulating is the wrong word, it's sort of the dominant feature of this bilateral relationship, I remember going to a big conference in Tbilisi back in a few years ago, which was meant to be it was the Silk Road Forum, and this was the Georgian government engaging with the Chinese government. Well, it didn't take me very long to figure out that actually it was the Xinjiang government, not the PRC Beijing government, and it also didn't take me long to figure out that it was really Xinjiang Hualing that was pushing this entire enterprise forwards from the Chinese perspective. And I think that the reason that we have to think about this in a sustainability sense is to then look at the Czech Republic, where within the Czech Republic, CEFC had a very embarrassing defenestration last year, with its leader suddenly getting pulled and disappeared into God knows where, all of their projects getting cancelled all over the place. And for the Czech Republic, that meant suddenly the overwhelming majority of the BRI projects, or the Chinese projects that they had, suddenly disappeared. And they had to get picked up by somebody else. And so that left that specific country and suddenly in a big problem. So I think if you look more broadly, the sustainability question, I think that's where you could see some curious, sharp reactions in some of these smaller economies that are suddenly taking massive Chinese loans or Chinese investments. Really, this is one company or one Chinese bank, not China writ large as we often articulate it. So I think that's maybe where I'd see the frictions. And then on your second question, Michael, talking about sort of India, I think India has... and people will disagree with this. I think India can never sign up to the BRI writ large because the BRI includes CPEC. CPEC cuts through a disputed piece of territory in Pakistan. End of story. Right? So India can never sign up to the BRI concept because CPEC is part of the BRI concept. But does India want Chinese investment? Yes, substantially so. When President Modi was, in charge in Gujarat, he was a prime seeker of Chinese investment into the region. Gujarat is twinned with, I think it's Guangdong in China, and that was done very much under Mr. Modi's reign. You can see India is seeking Chinese investment. They may not have signed up to BRI, but they have signed up to AIIB. There is the BRICS New Development Bank, which you made a very good point about, which is often also missed in these sort of bigger conversations. India is engaging with China economically, and in many ways engaging with many of the sort of expressions of BRI around the world, but it can never sign up to it lock stock because of this very specific issue with CPEC.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. I will only answer the sustainability issue because not quite sure about India's role, but I actually was challenging the sustainability issue because has BRI already taken off? I would think it's still in the process. So to what extent we would say it's sustainable? It's partially still in the building process. So I'm not very sure that how do we understand the sustainability of BRI. But of course, that is also in connection with Shelley you just mentioned about the domestic economic growth of China, whether the figure would be sustainable to afford such a big amount of investment. Apart from these figures that Shelley just provided, I would also say that within China, the domestic voices of the government invest so much abroad, but then the domestic issues are still quite unevenly developed. The gap wealth gap and poor gap in China poverty gap in China actually is still very big and huge. So the society is questioning the government that how would we invest so much abroad but not to look into our domestic issues like Raffaello just said. So these are the issues that whether the BRI could fully taken off, I think that would have to look into the domestic Chinese situation. And another observation I would say is, I would see that the recipient countries' responses to the BRI are quite different. Raffaello's examples of Central Asia so far, and from other scholars' research, Central Asia's receiving BRI's investment or infrastructure seems okay-ish. But the Southeast Asia countries, they're not quite happy with the money or infrastructure invested, not just because of the investment scale, but also, as I mentioned, the complication of the existing issue like South China Sea or the existing Chinese diasporas in the countries. So we can't take BRI as a full picture to see whether that is successful or not, because that is uneven development abroad and within of China. And lastly, come back to Shelley, your point, last point of the soft power. I actually also question about China's soft power, because whether that is already taken off, if we take back to a lot of controversies of the CI, Confucius Institute in North American universities, would that mean Chinese soft power is as successful as American soft power or any other countries? I have a big question mark on that. So that's my answer, yes.
Well, thank you. Great. So we have about 30 minutes, so we'll definitely get to your questions now. And I know we have to wait until you're recognized and have a microphone in front of you first. So we'll start on this side, the woman right here, second row from the front.
Hi, my name is Christine. I'm currently a student, postgrad student here. I have a few questions. First of all would be, for Shirley itself. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the whole association between the steel overcapacity in China as well as BRI, because there's been in the past, especially in 2016, mentions of that, basically steel dumping. The second one would be, Dr. Chun. So I did a bit of work with BRI in Malaysia itself, and I would just like to comment and say that beyond just the political shakeup it has been, most of the Forest City projects were actually targeted and for the Chinese audience. It was marketed as a winter home for the Chinese, and so it didn't really benefit Malaysians per se, despite it actually being marketed as that. And secondly, the proximity of Johor, of Forest City to Singapore was very close. You could actually see Singapore from Forest City. I was there and I saw for myself. So that raised a lot of concerns in Singapore. And also, I was wondering what your thoughts are on how exactly BRI in Southeast Asia has actually managed to push and pull and shake up ASEAN as a whole. Because we saw that a lot in 2016, and the comments on South China Sea. To stretch it even further, I was quite surprised how South China Sea was just mentioned once, because we see a lot of Philippines changing because of the whole BRI investments in South China Sea, so much so that President Xi threatened for war. Thank you.
May I just ask for a clarification on the first question? So you're talking about the relationship between the trade war? Steel dumping specifically in the Belton Road initiative?
Just steel specifically itself, because from my experience back in Malaysia itself, there were lots of concerns about how steel was affecting the Southeast Asian countries, and it was that view about how it seemed that all these investments in Southeast Asian countries in particular, it was just like a massive steel dump. So I think I'll narrow down just kind of what your thoughts are on BRI investments being a steel dump. Thank you.
Okay.
Does that make clarification?
Thank you. Why don't we take one more question? The woman, right there. That'll give everyone more time to think.
Oh, okay, I don't want to shout. Hi, Linda Chan. I'd like to thank the panelists for their presentations. The last two panelists touched on Africa. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, so the last two panelists touched on Africa. I would like to point out that at first, the Belton Road was very well received. But in recent times, they've been pushed back, especially in Kenya, for example. The perception is that the Belton Road is more really for the government, so the elites. Civil society are concerned about the scale and level of debt, the environmental issues, and although China might say, well, we want to involve civil society too, but the meetings are normally held with the ministers and so on and so forth, and so those on a lower food chain don't normally take part. And although Raphael mentioned the issue that, well, some countries are further away and there may be less concerns for China, the issue is China needs the natural resource from Africa. For example, cobalt, 70% comes from the DRC, so even though it's far away, they need the cobalt. So what do you think China is going to be doing to remedy the disquiet that is now brewing?
Okay. Well, that's a lot to chew on there. It's good questions. Who wants to start?
Shirley.
Yeah.
I had a question, but it's actually the first time I've gotten that question, so thank you. I'll try my best. So the first thing is, starting from about 2013-ish, there has been a lot of talks about supply-side reform inside China. And as we know, in political economies, the international economic situation are closely linked with the domestic situation. And so at that time, there was a lot of excess capacity that was built over the decades prior inside China, both not only in steel production, but also in coal productions, in a lot of the raw material production areas. And so the Belt and Road Initiative also started coincidentally in 2013. And so at the time, a lot of the economists inside China talked about it's essentially a practical strategy for China to export our excess capacity to the regional countries. And because they are developing and in a way that, because China is trying to move up to the supply chain, and these countries are coming up. And so it's probably at that opportune time where our industrial capacity could be just utilized across the region. And so there is an element to the export of the domestic capacity to these regional countries with the steel export that you just talked about. And the other thing is, remember, the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially infrastructure building initiative, right? From its very beginning, and it's very, I should say, innocent idea. And so the infrastructure construction is closely connected to raw materials, and a lot of steels will be used for railroads and ports and you name it. And so it's probably not so surprising that you see a huge amount of steel export to these Belt and Road regional countries. And so really, what you see, there can be a lot of press headlines talking about the dumping or not dumping, so I'll leave that as a separate issue. What we can understand in this international situation is that it's really partly driven by the domestic economic situation inside China, and China will continue to export our excess capacity at the same time to fully implement our supply-side reform.
Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, the Forest City is what and you were there to see that it's very close. I was coming from Singapore to Forest Cities. It was only 40 minutes taxi ride, sort of. And the concept of Chinese houses is actually very alien to most of the local community, in the sense that if you were in the process of going there, you could see there's nothing in between. And then suddenly that beautiful houses appeared, and then how do the local community to see and to perceive that those 700,000 people of the wealthy Chinese to be there as part of them or not part of them, this is a really kind of an issue there. And this is only one case among the others. So that's what I mentioned about the local communities' responses. In Jerubahu is that. In Myanmar is the dam building project, which I didn't have time to mention about. That caused environmental protest, civil society. The same concept or logic of the Chinese developers is they invest a huge amount of infrastructure and money, and they think that is good for locality, which actually is not that simple. And this is the logic that I was trying to explain using the case of Forest City. And very good question about China-ASEAN relationship, pull and push. ASEAN, as you might understand, is not a very tight unity. They are actually loose community compared to the EU. And Chinese way to work with ASEAN is not to work with a whole group, it's individual discussion or negotiation. And to play around these individual dealings with each different ASEAN countries. So I do not see ASEAN as a whole would have a strategy towards China's BRI, but individual countries more. And you are very right that South China Sea dispute still there. China's 9-line, 11-line really make, especially Vietnam, very unhappy. And this is what I mentioned about in the 2014 anti-Chinese riots in Vietnam, the seeds of that. Of course, many of other sources mention that this is just a small grain, but in fact, this is one important element added on the recipient country, for instance, Vietnam, Philippines, are not happy with Chinese investment. Yeah.
Anyone else? Please, Nadege.
Okay. Going back to the rationale for Belton Road and why why did the leadership choose to do it? Partly the overcapacity issue was the reason. After the global financial crisis of 2008, China launched a stimulus, an economic stimulus, and started to invest a lot in its own domestic infrastructure. That created a lot of that surplus capacity. In 2013, one of the rationales behind Belton Road was to sustain this impetus for the Chinese economy, but within a country that was already saturated with white elephants. So you're pushing outwards, you're pushing for new markets to export that overcapacity abroad. So it's not just about steel, but it's cement, it's different categories of oversupply that China has and wants to now export. So that's part of the rationale behind Belton Road. The shakeup of the ASEAN is also something that we have witnessed closer to London and closer to the European Union, actually. So Belton Road now has conflated. There's many things that are within Belton Road. So we're talking about Chinese foreign investments. We're talking about Chinese foreign policy concept. We're talking about China's rise in general. So there's a lot of things that go together when we're talking about Belton Road. So it's a question of how this growing power, economic and political, and more military power from China is influencing the political decisions of the countries in ASEAN or even in Europe. So here we have very specific examples of the correlation between those Chinese investments in infrastructure have had a direct political impact on political decisions made by the governments. And I'm talking about Greece in particular, where the investments have been very important. I don't have the figures in my head right now, but The political impact has been seen in different examples, including Greece pushing inside of the European Union's discussions about the South China Sea after the Hague Tribunal, not to mention or to kind of water down the joint communique from the EU. So that's one. Also Greece refusing to sign the EU Declaration on the Human Rights in China, for example. So there's and I think Hungary as well. Now maybe I'm conflating the different examples, but there's a very clear correlation between Chinese investment and a political decision that is favorable to China. So about the question of the African pushback, Belton Road is also China's outward expansion of its own way of doing things. So what I mean by that is that Chinese authorities are very elitist, and they're very, they want to control and they do control their own civil society. And so going outwards and using their newfound power and diplomacy, they're also carrying with them this habit of being elitist and not paying attention too much to the civil society. However, and so it's very difficult for them to adapt to this level of habit, to engage with the local communities. The West have tried more or less to do better, but not with great success either. So I think the tensions that we see mostly come from the perception of these activities. And so what the Chinese leadership has in mind is not much to change their own way of dealing with the local communities as it is to influence the perception. You see what I mean? There's a difference between real engagement with the local civil societies as opposed to shaping the perception. And there, the work that the Chinese government is doing is with the local media. So there are lots of programs that are actually within Belton Road Initiative to train and equip the local journalists in Beijing. So they go for a training program of several weeks where they get better understanding, I'll put that in quote, of China, and then go back to their countries, sometimes with some content, video contents, documentaries that have been given to them by the Chinese propaganda apparatus. And they project that to the local television, but also without any sourcing of the origin of the documentary. So see, it's slightly changing the perception of the Chinese influence of those countries.
Okay. Did you want to say?
I had some very brief points
Briefly,
on the Africa point in particular. I think the first questions were addressed very completely by my colleagues on the panel. I think my point about Africa and it being less sort of immediately important to Beijing as Central Asia is that Central Asia is right next door. Yes, you're right, China wants cobalt from DRC, but DRC or whoever controls the mines in DRC will sell that cobalt to whoever will buy it, if that's China or whoever else. So I don't necessarily know if that's exactly the same sort of a relationship, whereas if in Central Asia things go very bad and the relationship there with the country sours to the point where you have some sort of a breakdown, well, you've got a real problem which directly touches on your border and directly touches into your country, which doesn't necessarily apply within that particular one. So I think that was the sort of comparator I was offering there. In terms of your point about pushback, I agree 100%. There is a substantial pushback that you can increasingly see, and it is driven. I think Nadege's point about, this being China kind of, is an elite kind of structure, and you sort of talk to other elites, but that's what they can kind of understand, and this is what they can kind of reach out and talk to. And if you're talking about state-owned enterprises, they all come and talk to the state. They won't necessarily engage. Now, having said that, I would say there is, I think the sort of influence operations about shaping the local media content is a big driver of what I think China's doing there. But, there is effort going in Beijing to try to get their companies to be more responsive to local environments and local communities. And again, I think it's a question of you have to look at which companies you're talking about. So if you look at a company like CNPC, which has been out in the world for some time, it was one of the first Chinese companies to get pushed out into the world because, an energy company, you have to. There's only so much at home. Once you've mined that, well, you've got to find it elsewhere. And so they've been engaging in parts of the world for about 20 years. And so you've got people within the institution who have a sense of, well, if I go into this country and I just go to the local government, I get the local government to sign the contract, and then I go to the local village and say, hello, I'm here to build a mine or a well or whatever, and I just go ahead and do it, well, the locals will say, hey, hold on a minute, the government is far away and they don't always control this part of the world, and did you talk to the local leader actually? And so these sorts of issues start to encounter, and so the company learns. And so you can see within CNPC, they have developed practices about trying to engage locals. And so when you're looking at them, you're looking at a company that has a slightly more sophisticated view of the world and approach to the world. That's not true of everyone. And I think in a lot of African contexts, you can see it's some of the big infrastructure companies that are only recently getting pushed out into the world, and they're basically taking the practice that they took in China and just said, okay, we're going to do what we used to do at home, which is, have 24-hour work days, 7-day work weeks, work until the project's done, and then maybe pay everyone, maybe not, have them live in miserable conditions, and that's what we'll deliver, right? Because that's what we do at home. But, lo and behold, in Kenya, for example, that's not the practice. People have a different kind of work-life balance attitude and everything else. And so the company is trying to figure out. And so there is a big effort going on at the Ministry of Commerce in particular to try to get the companies to become more responsive to this, because it is causing China huge problems on the ground. And that is reflected in the sort of local communities complaining while the central governments may be signed up to it. And, the Chinese get angry about this. They say, hey, hold on a second. Your capital said we could do this project. Can we just do the project, please? And so those issues are ones. But the one point I would make about this, in terms of these problems and their long-term resonance, is yes, they cause problems to the Chinese company on the ground. But I would make the point that these countries, for the most part, still want investment. And they still want these projects to come to their country. And I think Egypt's an interesting case study of this, where you had, Egypt was a major partner for the Chinese government. The government of President Mubarak fell after the events of the Arab Spring and, was pushed out. And we had the government of President Morsi come in. And fairly seamlessly, you saw the Chinese contracts roll over from one, Mubarak, to President Morsi. And then when President Morsi gets defenestrated and President al-Sisi comes in, well, things roll over fairly seamlessly into al-Sisi, and you can still see that the relationship with Egypt has remained fairly constant throughout that, because the underlying logic of wanting investment is still salient for these countries, no matter who's in power. So that's a slight caveat I'd add to some of these concerns about, local complaints and local pushback.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to try to get as many questions as possible with the small amount of time that's left. So I'd propose that we take a round of questions, and I'd ask that you propose your question with brevity and that the responses are made with brevity as well. So the first question was the gentleman here with the purple tie. You had your hand up for a while. Yep, right to your left. Mike's to your left.
Thanks very much. I'm Robin Lamb. I'm on the board of the Royal Society of Asian Affairs, but I'm also executive director of a couple of North African British business councils, including on Egypt and Libya. So my question is relates to the partnership on investment and growth in Africa, which was signed by the UK and Chinese entities, perhaps I should say, in 2015. And I just wonder if this is typical in any way of the BRI program, or that it's likely to be totally separate. If it's not typical, how would the Chinese view it, in fact? Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to go all the way to the back. The gentleman, I think that's almost the last row. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Adil Sultan from King's College. Raffaello, excellent presentation. Just a clarification as I understood. You said on India's question, India will never participate in BRI because of this disputed territory. If I understood correct, I just want to politely contest this. This is not because of the disputed territory. I think it is, in a way, gives China more influence in that region. That's the major reason for India. So anything that enhances Chinese influence and reduces or limits India's influence, it will oppose to that project. Because if it is about disputed territory, India could have stayed out of CPEC and might have joined other projects or the legs of the BRI project. So it's not about disputed territory, it's an excuse to target China or to criticize BRI. That's my opinion. I would like to have your views.
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman right here. Yep, right there.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a PhD student in IR in University of Oxford. I have a few questions for Dr. Lee. You mentioned South China Sea many times in your presentation. And what do you think of China's relationship with the Philippines? Because before 2016, China-Philippine relations seems to be very bad. However, the two countries managed to cooperate with each other after Mr. Duterte came into power. So probably this is an example that regional states in Southeast Asia can still cooperate with China, even if we have disputes with each other. And the second question, you mentioned the dashed line. Actually, it is exactly the nationalist government in 1947 proposed the dashed line. As far as I am concerned, Taiwanese government still claims almost the same with the Chinese mainland government in the South China Sea disputes, even for the Tsai Ing-wen government. And also Vietnam claimed all of the Nansha and the Shisha separately islands, and the Taiwan right now is occupying Taiping Island. Itu Aba Island right now. So we can see that different claims or territory disputes still also exist between Vietnam and also probably Taiwan. So why do these two governments still, probably you believe that they can cooperate, however Chinese mainland government cannot cooperate with Vietnam? I believe that for the bilateral relationship between China and Vietnam is actually very complicated. It's also related to history and contemporary issues. So probably it's problematic for you to simplify the situation to the South China Sea disputes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. And then we're going to take one more question. I think it was right up here. You had your hand up earlier, much earlier. Yeah, okay. And then after this, we'll take one more, and that should put enough on the table.
Bahauddin Latif. A number of points, actually. Confucius is a common denominator with a lot of Southeastern Asian nations. Japan and Vietnam share Confucius with China. Because China and strategically, I think China could play the Confucius card with the region in the long term. There are benefits to China and to the region, I think. The second point is really China's involvement in South Asia. I mean, in a country as contested as Pakistan, what was West Pakistan, I think China's involvement in that country is, in my view, problematic. I mean, there could be a blowback as America's relationship with Pakistan in relation to Afghanistan. So I think that China should be cautious on that front. The third point, which I think is crucial, India. Now, India is actually a hugely underdeveloped country, even compared to Africa. Half of India's population, I'm talking about children, are malnourished. Half of India's children are malnourished. 90% of Indians do not have toilets. Forget about infrastructure. And this is a country which has, of course, feels itself proud and wants to play a huge role. It has a huge population. Its population is bigger than the entire continent of Africa, yet is half as poor as Africa. Africa is actually richer than India. People do not realize this. India's economy is the size of Mexico, for heaven's sake. But India's, in terms of its its image, self-image, is huge. Now, my view is that China could.
Sorry, do you think you could try to wrap up?
The point
I
is
have a question. Now's a good time to pose it.
In terms of infrastructure development, China has the ability to develop India. its roads. I mean, India built a bridge recently in Assam, I think 2-3 days ago, which took 20 years to build. A bridge that China could probably build in a year. But the problem is that, in a way, what I'm really getting at is that we in the West have a problem with China because we fear China's rise. Quite rightly, we fear China's rise. But unfortunately, it's also mediating a sort of viewpoint across the world which is problematic for example, in Africa, they fear China's involvement because they fear that China will become another Britain or France. But I wonder if China is actually that way inclined. China is interested in resources for its own national development. But I doubt if China wants to plant its toe on India or Central Asia or Africa.
Right. Okay.
And I really want you to consider this issue.
Okay. We understand. It's a fair point. All right. What I would propose, we're getting to the end. Maybe we can go down the row here and invite each of our panelists to address any of the questions they would like to briefly. Anyone want to start?
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
go ahead.
Then, yes, I would start with the China-Taiwan part. I think it's very good you point out the Philippines, the Churchill's decision, but don't forget, in the region, it's not just about China. I would suggest to look at the Philippines' relationship with America. And I think the Churchill is using China card to play around China-USA. So I'm not quite sure whether we could put that into Philippines is a good cooperation with China because of other reasons. I would say that, again, that is the answer to the previous lady's question. It's individual countries' strategic consideration to work with China in ASEAN country. And back to the South China Sea issue. In fact, in my presentation, only mentioned once, the lady said that, and you actually feel that I mentioned too much. But in the sense of that, it's interesting from these two perspectives. But yes, you are right. Each countries have different versions. But if we look into the geopolitics situation, who has the actual voice? Taiwan, of course, wants to claim the same as China did, but that's a declaration that everybody would understand. The real conflicts would arise with China's real power arise in the region, and that's the situation comes into the issue. But please also, if I don't present clearly, please do understand, I do not say South China Sea is the only issue. I say this is one issue among the Chinese diasporas in the region, in the Southeast Asia countries. Their complicated position with the local government already existed, as you mentioned, many, many years. So on top of that, with the external situation with South China Sea, that creates complicated picture. So this is what I could see that it's not just one set of the South China Sea version, but who actually would have the power to say which version is right or not. I think everybody would have a clear answer on that.
Thank you. Dr. Yu?
I'd like to talk about two generic points. The first one is in the foreseeable future, when we look at the maritime Silk Road, namely Asia-Pacific, South China Sea, or Indo-Pacific, however you name it, in the foreseeable future, we are going to see a divergence of the paradigm in that region. That is a economic Asia and a security Asia. The economic Asia is going to be led by China, and the security Asia is undoubtedly going to be led by the United States. And so talking about the Philippines issue specifically, Philippines understand that when it comes to economic cooperation with the Asia-Pacific region, the de facto partner will be China as the preferred choice. But when it comes to security issues, they would side with the United States. And so that is for out of practical purposes for a lot of the countries in that region, it's the pragmatic thinking. Again, it's from a real political perspective. They understand the divergence of economics and security. The second point I'd like to mention is for Africa. Last November, there was a huge summit called the China-Africa Summit that happened in November in Beijing. So President Xi Jinping met with, I believe, a dozen state leaders from African countries. They all came over to Beijing to have this huge summit. And my office happens to be next door, and so traffic was jammed for 3 days. As a result of that, not only heads of state came over to Beijing, to essentially to recognize the influence of China. China has promised roughly about $60 billion of investments into these African countries. At the same time, African students, I hear a lot of talks in Beijing recently that for African students to come to Beijing, they get a scholarship versus Chinese students when they go to the same universities, they don't get the same award. And so there's a lot of emphasis on educating the future leaders in Africa. And so though these things boils down to I think a fundamental premise, that is what was talked about a little bit earlier in the morning. It's the Chinese ancient notion of all under heaven. The all under heaven concept is non-aggressive. It's nothing like the Western style of colonialism in the past. The China's all under heaven view of world order is essentially a state tributary system. It's essentially for the regional countries, periphery countries to come to China, to pay tribute and respect, to respect and recognize the cultural superiority of China during ancient times. And if you look at this China-Africa Summit, it sounds and feels and looks a little bit just like that. And so there is an element of that recognition and respect. And also when I was in Africa, when I was in Zambia a couple of years ago, the taxi driver was very interesting. He said, oh, this project is built by China, it's the football stadium. This project is built by China, it's the city hall. Oh, the toilets are built by the United States. Go figure, it's a lot of prestige projects that China built. Talking about financial viability and economic returns, I do not think that is the only criteria, to say the least, when China makes this sort of African investment decisions. And so really, we have to, coming from thousands of years of Confucius civilization, I think that recognition and respect and how it plays into China's foreign diplomacy today can be a very interesting perspective to understand these issues. And on India, I just wanted to say nothing more than that the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's a multilateral institution to pump all these investment projects in the region. The vice president of AIIB is essentially Indian scholar. And so there is an active participation in there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Raffaello, last
Thank you.
brief thoughts.
I have some very brief thoughts. I mean, on the question about the agreement that was signed, I think it was 2015, you said, between the UK and China and Africa. I mean, there's a few of these that have been signed. The French have signed something similar as well. And the idea, essentially the way I would articulate it is I think it was a recent push that you've seen from European countries for the most part, but also others as well, which is this thing is happening with China. How do we connect with it in other places? And they tend to look for kind of what they would consider neutral locations, and Africa often falls under that basket as a place that needs development. The Chinese are coming in there. We've been doing long-term kind of DFID or aid projects there. We need to try to find a way of connecting with it. I think from everything I hear is it's not been clear that it's all quite clicked into place. Because they're struggling to figure out what it actually means. So you've had a lot of these agreements signed, but if you try to dig into what's actually happened, it's very difficult to find, often because really nothing has, because genuinely people are struggling. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think one, it's that we tend to think of the Chinese system as a sort of totally controlled thing, but actually who's delivering the project on the ground is a company. And that company has a very specific set of goals and things that it's doing, which has been sent from by Beijing or its central leadership there. It doesn't necessarily think of these kind of national issues in the same sort of a way. And so the big problem has been that, you've got the governments will sign these agreements, DFID and Chinese counterparts, and then lo and behold, the agreement's signed, but nothing kind of comes out of it because no one quite knows how that's all going to piece together. And there's all sorts of feasibility studies and work that's going into it to try to figure out how to do that. Because, the ultimate idea is, we're both working on these countries or working in them. Why don't we kind of cooperate or collaborate? At its most basic, it's just about making sure we're both not doing the same thing. There are some examples you can look at where you'll see that, I remember some cases in Afghanistan where, the Western aid contractor was doing a hospital here, the Chinese aid contractor was building roads somewhere else, but no one bothered to connect up the dots, and so you've got roads going nowhere and hospitals not connected to anything. So, so at its most basic, that's what it looks like. At its more strategic, it's about really thinking about how we can cooperate together in these kind of locations, but it hasn't quite clicked in terms of my understanding yet. On the points about India, about South Asia, really more generally, I think the only point I say on that is, I think, China doesn't want to get stuck in a conflict between India and Pakistan. It needs both of these countries to sort of function and function with it and function together fundamentally if it's going to develop and have a prosperous neighborhood which ultimately will help China develop. So I don't think it wants to get pulled between that. And you can see that it's trying to strike a sort of balance between the two and trying to figure a way forward. It's interesting if you think back to 2008, when there was the attack in Mumbai that was linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba, an organization that has training camps in Pakistan. Chinese diplomats did a lot of shuttle diplomacy between those two capitals to try to calm that situation down, because we really were heading towards a very substantial escalation of conflict, and there was a lot of work that went into there by Chinese diplomacy to try to assuage this, because the last thing they want is this to turn into some sort of catastrophic conflict, because that's right on their border. The water supplies for most of sort of that part of China ultimately emanate from these regions. It's got massive repercussions if you have a massive conflict there. They've got no desire for that to happen. And so I would argue actually that you'll see China is often trying to find a way of striking a balance and trying to make sure that they can keep some sort of a relationship going with both. And actually both kind of want to have that relationship back with China because they want the investment, they need the investment. And I think actually some of the rhetoric, I'm not sure again we've seen anything really materially come of it yet, of this discussion of China and India cooperating in Afghanistan, is a reflection of this. Here you've got Afghanistan, a country for which Pakistan has got very strong feelings and links and connections, that, neighbors China, that India also has deep interest in, that China's talking about working with India there, because ultimately they think that this has to all work together to ultimately serve China's sort of greater good. So
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nadege, the final word. All done? Excellent. I'm sorry that we couldn't take more questions. Time really flies when you're having a great discussion. But I wanted to thank this panel and our panelists this morning, as well as the Lao China Institute, King's College, and especially RSAA, Michael Ryder and his colleagues, Sarah and others. A lot of work goes into these types of events. So I think that a round of applause for all would be very useful right now. Thank you. Were you taking a final? No. Okay, well, thank you very much. And a reminder that